Hey everyone and welcome. I am absolutely thrilled to be your host today as we unpack some truly eye-opening concepts from Chapter 6 of our criminology source material. Over the course of this 10-minute explainer, we're going to dive deep into what is known as the hidden economy. Historically, early criminologists were intensely focused on visible urban poverty and street-level offending. They were completely missing the invisible offenses happening right behind closed doors. But today we're shedding light on these hidden crimes that literally drain billions from our global economy and arguably have the most profound impact on our daily lives.
So let's kick things off with a pretty provocative question. What does a criminal actually look like? When we hear that word, our minds almost instinctively jump straight to the streets, right? We picture a robbery, a burglary, maybe a mugging. It's highly visible. It's immediate. But today we're really going to challenge those deep-seated assumptions. We are shifting our lens entirely away from the streets, and instead, we're focusing on the suites, the state, and the server rooms. Because, as we'll see, that is where the most costly offenses actually take place.
To do that effectively, we've structured this explainer into a three-part thematic expose. First up, crimes of the powerful. Second, markets and morals. And finally, we'll wrap up with the borderless frontier. All right, let's jump right into our first act, Part 1, Crimes of the Powerful, covering white-collar, corporate, political, and green crime.
The absolute perfect place to start here is with Edwin Sutherland. He actually coined the term white-collar crime way back in 1939, and he did it to make a really pointed argument. The justice system was completely obsessed with the crimes of the poor while totally ignoring the far costlier crimes of the respectable. Sutherland's concept forces us to realize that, who gets labeled a criminal is often just a reflection of power. Just consider the financial toll for a second. A burglar might steal a television worth a few $100s, but a single white-collar fraudster, they can wipe out millions of dollars in pension funds with just a few keystrokes, fundamentally devastating the lives of thousands of retirees. By most estimates, the financial impact of white-collar crime absolutely dwarfs all street property crime combined. It's really wild to think about.
Now, it is absolutely crucial to distinguish between two very different types of white-collar crime. On one hand, we have occupational crime. This is essentially just personal greed, an employee embezzling funds or committing expense fraud against their boss. But on the other hand, we have corporate crime. And this is institutionalized harm committed by the organization itself to advance its market position. We're talking about things like price fixing or knowingly selling unsafe products. Imagine a massive corporation deciding it's actually cheaper to simply pay out legal settlements for a defective product rather than issuing a highly costly recall. That is a chilling calculation made in a boardroom, and it gets normalized right inside the organizational culture as just a necessary strategy to meet relentless financial targets.
So, understanding why these massive corporate crimes are systematically underdetected and underpunished brings us to a really fascinating concept researchers call diffuse victimization. Think about it like this. If someone violently robs you on the street, you know you're a victim, and you immediately call the police, right? But what if a massive corporation shaves a mere 5 cents off 10 million consumers' monthly accounts, or slowly contaminates a local water supply over a decade? The harm is immense in total, but it's spread so incredibly thinly that individual victims might not even realize they've been harmed. Because no single complaining victim has lost enough to launch a massive lawsuit, the corporation just gets away with millions.
And this dynamic brilliantly illustrates the focus of green criminology, which looks at environmental harm strictly through the lens of crime. We're talking about illegal dumping, unlawful emissions, and the illicit wildlife trade. Notice how these offenses really blur the boundary between a traditional crime and a mere regulatory violation. Because our legal definitions often lag far behind real social harm, well-resourced corporate actors can completely exploit this gap. A chemical plant might do the math and realize, hey, paying a regulatory fine for dumping toxic waste is actually millions of dollars cheaper than installing the legally required filtration systems. It becomes merely the cost of doing business rather than a catalyst for true criminal prosecution.
Shifting gears over to political crime and terrorism, this famous quote perfectly captures the conflict perspective. It shows us that defining crime is often a fierce, high-stakes contest of power and perspective. Terrorism is fundamentally the propaganda of the deed, violence specifically used as a message intended to create widespread fear and advance a political or ideological goal. But who actually receives that severe label? Well, that heavily depends on who is holding the pen and drafting the laws.
When analyzing political crime impartially, we really have to look in two directions. Yes, there are crimes against the state, things like treason, espionage, and sedition, but we must also look at crimes by the state, This includes official corruption, illegal surveillance, or the aggressive suppression of rights. The justice response here raises some of the hardest questions in any free society. How do democracies balance the urgent need for security with the preservation of liberty? To stop a legitimate threat, a state might argue it needs sweeping surveillance powers, but that exact same surveillance can so easily morph into a violation of privacy and constitutional rights. There are no easy answers here, only really profound trade-offs.
Let's move into our second act, markets and morals, covering organized crime, public order offenses, and drugs.
It is so vital to understand that modern organized crime isn't just about the hierarchical mob families you see in classic movies. Today, we view it through the enterprise model. This simply means that wherever there is strong public demand for a banned good or service, whether that's drugs, illegal gambling, or counterfeit products, criminal enterprises will naturally arise to supply it. The demand doesn't magically disappear just because something is prohibited by law. It just goes underground. And when you're operating underground, you can't exactly sue a rival for breaching a contract. Therefore, violence replaces contracts in courts as the only available mechanism to settle disputes.
Which brings us right to the intense debate over public order offenses, sometimes controversially called victimless crimes. Let's take illegal gambling or illicit drug use as an example. On one side, proponents of criminalization argue that these behaviors fundamentally damage communities and violate moral standards that a society is entirely entitled to enforce. On the flip side, proponents of decriminalization argue that prohibiting consensual conduct actually creates far more harm than it prevents. They argue that criminalizing these acts generates those violent black markets we just talked about, wastes billions in enforcement resources, and pushes vulnerable users away from medical help and straight into the criminal justice system.
This perfectly sets up the complex link between drugs and crime, which criminologists break down into three distinct parts. First is the psychopharmacological link. This is the direct chemical effect of the substance, like alcohol causing aggressive disinhibition. Second is the economic compulsive link. This involves individuals committing property crimes strictly to feed an addiction, like someone stealing a car solely because they're desperate to pawn parts and avoid severe physical withdrawal. But pay really close attention to that third step, the systemic link. So much of the violence attributed to drugs is actually a direct product of the market's illegality. It's rival sellers violently enforcing agreements and protecting their territory with weapons. That is completely systemic to the hidden economy.
For our final act, we look to the future. Part 3, the borderless frontier, covering cybercrime and transnational crime.
Let's first look at transnational crime, which flourishes wherever profit is high and international enforcement is fragmented. Now, it is absolutely critical we don't confuse smuggling with trafficking. Smuggling is fundamentally a transportation offense against a state's border, entered into voluntarily by the person being smuggled. Human trafficking, however, is a horrific offense against a person. It is defined by exploitation, force, or coercion, and it's often fueled by profound global inequality. And sadly, it is really important to remember that human trafficking can occur right within a single neighborhood. Crossing an international border is not required to commodify a human being. Because organized criminal networks relentlessly exploit these fragmented laws across different jurisdictions, fighting them is incredibly difficult. Local police can't just cross into another sovereign country to make an arrest. Instead, justice systems have to rely on slow, highly complex international cooperation. This means negotiating mutual legal assistance treaties, which allow prosecutors in one country to gather admissible evidence in another. It requires extradition agreements to force a suspect captured abroad to be sent back to face trial. Because this whole process is so incredibly cumbersome, the most effective strategy often isn't arresting highly replaceable individuals, but attacking the network's finances through sophisticated anti-money laundering intelligence.
And that borderless nature brings us to the fastest changing category of offending out there, cybercrime. We can break cybercrime down into two distinct categories to better understand it. First, cyber-dependent crimes. These are things that literally could not exist without computers, like writing malware, deploying ransomware, or hacking a secure server. Cyber-enabled crimes, on the other hand, are old, traditional crimes, like fraud or extortion, that are simply supercharged by modern technology. The internet has completely changed the scale of victimization. A single motivated offender on a laptop can now target thousands of victims globally in a matter of seconds, all while hiding behind complex layers of encryption that make their communications totally unreadable to police and then moving their profits anonymously through cryptocurrency.
What's truly fascinating here is how a classic criminological theory, routine activities theory, maps so perfectly into the digital age. For a crime to occur, you need three intersecting elements: the motivated offenders, Well, they are now hackers located literally anywhere on the globe. The suitable targets? That's everyone online holding valuable personal data or access to funds. And the capable guardians? Think about it. If a hacker targets an unpatched corporate server holding millions of credit cards, the only thing stopping them isn't a locked physical door or a police officer on patrol. The capable guardian is strong cybersecurity, multi-factor authentication, and robust encryption protocols. This shows us that in the digital age, crime prevention relies heavily on secure system design rather than just after-the-fact law enforcement.
I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. We have seen throughout this explainer that modern crime is a rapidly moving target. It is increasingly borderless, digitally mediated, and deeply hidden within legitimate institutional power. So if criminal opportunity is continually evolving into this global and highly organized hidden economy, is our local, street-focused justice system truly equipped to fight it? How must our pursuit of justice adapt to keep up with crimes that just don't respect borders or physical locked doors? It is a massive societal challenge for sure, but understanding the true, expansive scope of the hidden economy is the very first step. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember, keep asking the tough questions.